This podcast is recorded on stolen and unceded Aboriginal land.
We acknowledge the First Nations and elders of this country and join their calls for justice. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land.
Talk about the Greens, that bunch of idiots.
If you want the dole for life, free marijuana, vote Greens.
The Greens are not what they were, and they never will be again.
Yeah, that is sad indeed.
We're stuck with the hosts of Chapo Shithouse podcast.
Serious danger to Australia.
We will analyse the election and have correct opinions.
such as it is.
Yeah. I'm trying to figure out if my voice feels a little bit hoarse, even though I wasn't exactly partying super hard at this thing last night.
Well, your voice sounds lovely on this end.
Oh, yeah. Maybe it's got a sexy husk to it. Yeah.
Always, though. It always has a sexy husk to it.
Thank you. Yeah. See, this is what we rarely pass the Bechdel test on this show. Yeah. It's always like, so this is good. You know, I feel really like a proper feminist.
That's Australian politics. Which white man do we want to talk about today?
Exactly. Yeah. Well, maybe we should get into it. This is Serious Danger, dear listener. This is a podcast about green politics in Australia produced by Michael the Griff Griffin. It is not an official Greens Party podcast, so please stop asking. I'm Emerald Moon. I'm recording, as always, on Yagara and Turrbal country, and I'm joined this week by a special guest co-host, former Guardian journalist, current chief political analyst at the Australia Institute. Welcome back, Amy Remeikis.
Thank you for having me, Emerald. It's lovely to be hosting something with you. I usually get Tom.
Yeah, I know. You kind of got the warm up, but now you've got the real deal. So
and now I'm in the big leagues. Now I've got the A grade. Yeah. Yeah.
We send little old Tom out there. Hardly anyone knows who he is. It's, but I like to provide a platform for Tom. So
yeah. You're doing a fantastic job. You're so generous.
Thank you. Yeah, that's right. I want to use my power for good. So this is our final weekly episode before the election. And so we're going to look back on the campaign so far, kind of how the parties have positioned themselves in relation to defining issues and particularly what has been missing maybe in the campaign. Before we get into it, though, I do want to just say thank you to the people who have signed up on our Patreon. We have some new patrons, Suzanne, Nick, Patrick, Alice, Peter, Meg, and the big fella. So welcome. Thank you for signing up on patreon.com/seriousdangerau. That's how we run the show. It's $3 a month, however much you want to chip in, and that's how we pay Mike, our producer. It's how we do live shows, how we do the bonus candidate episodes that we've been doing. We just put out our final one of those before the election with the candidate for Macnamara, Sonia Semmons. Really great chat, really interesting, obviously a battleground seat and a very interesting seat. So go have a listen to that. And yes, if you have an extra $3 a month, you're not a patron already, please consider signing up because that's how we keep the show running.
Just all the big fellas, just a shout out to all the big fellas out there.
That's right. And I also feel as though I'm missing, I didn't write this down, but now I'm thinking there was an extra Patreon. People have started signing up on the Patreon with names that they just want us to read out on the show. And I feel as though I'm missing one here that was something like we need to start talking about a UBI or a livable guarantee. It was something like that. And so people are just lobbying for their policies now. So I'm sorry I missed you.
Universal basic income. We love the MMT folk. So sign up with whatever.
Yeah, that's right. Someone was saying last night, I was at the Greens vote party in Brisbane with Abby Chatfield, and people were like, is this, your podcast audience? And I was like, I think, how do I say this kindly about my lovely listeners? Probably these people are slightly more on the cool spectrum. Our listeners are more on the MMT spectrum, and that's also cool in its own way. But it's a
It's just there's varying degrees of the cool spectrum. I feel, and
exactly.
The MMT cool spectrum is probably going to change the world at some point. They're going to have their moment. It just might not be right now.
Yeah, because right now is dancing on stage with a giant toothbrush while Adam Bant DJs.
Yes, this is the moment that we're in. This is what 2025 has brought us to. It is the giant toothpaste and toothbrush moment. Obviously, being all over national television, everyone's calling this the toothbrush election. MMT will get their chance.
Yeah, that's right. It'll be the MMT election next. So you've been covering the election you've been doing like a live blog I've seen on the Australia Institute website. You obviously have been keeping across what's going on, what's being announced, that sort of thing. I want to get to some of the policy offerings in a second, but maybe first, do you feel like it's been a slightly less exciting election campaign overall for Australian politics?
It's so weird because are any election campaigns exciting in Australian politics? And I don't necessarily think they are because like our mainstream politics is so narrow. Like it's just basically a reflective strip when it comes to the major parties. And that doesn't mean that they're the same, but it also doesn't mean that they're entirely different when it comes to their policy offerings either. I mean, obviously there are some people you would prefer to be in charge rather than others in the Australian political space, but that doesn't mean that the ones that you'd like to be in charge are notoriously better when it comes to policy offerings.
Very inspiring.
And I think the last election, I know, so inspiring. I think the last election maybe felt more exciting because we were so over Scott Morrison and just the fuckery that was that coalition government over that 9 or so years, that just the thought of change made everyone excited. And it didn't kind of matter what that change was. We were just like, it is just time for something different. Whereas this election, the reality has settled in, maybe we've moved in with our situationship and we're just wondering whether this was the right choice for us, but we're looking at our other options just going, actually, no, not a hell of a lot of change out there. So maybe we should just stick with this and see if we can improve them. I can fix them. Which is obviously what the crossbench and the Greens have been trying to do when it comes to this Labor government. So
some say they're
kind of
Delulu.
gritting our teeth. Yeah. Delulu is the Salulu, I hear. I think we're all just kind of gritting our teeth and trying to get through it as intact as possible.
Yeah. I mean, extending the analogy, it's like perhaps also Australian voters are looking at those who have left their stable but underwhelming relationships and now moved into like the dating market or something new, and it's going terribly for them and it's really frightening, and so everyone's just too scared to kind of go for change. A lot of people are, that's how a lot of
they've
progressive people are feeling.
America has left its very stable and corporate boyfriend for the guy they met at the conference, and now they're going, this actually is not the greatest idea that I've ever had in my life. But it's a really interesting point that you raise, because I think the American election could have been the Australian election and may still be in a few years' time, because I don't think Donald Trump, I mean, obviously racist, fascist, all the rest of it, he's horrendous. But I don't think the people who voted for Donald Trump in the mainstream were even thinking about that. They were just voting against the status quo. They just got to the point where they just went, anything has to be better than this, because the Democrats had promised 4 years of more of the same. So we're going to keep doing exactly what we've been doing and hope you enjoy that. Where Donald Trump promised that he would completely overturn everything. And he has. That's what he's done. And it hasn't turned out well for a whole heap of people outside of a very small class of billionaires, soon to be trillionaires, I imagine, at the end of the Trump presidency. But that's what the population got to. They went, we need to vote against the status quo. And I think that Australian politics this time around has probably been saved a lot by the Trump election, because there's been enough time come through that people have seen those populist policies and how they're enacted and just gone, well, shit, like that seems like an absolute toxic cesspit that I don't actually want to get involved in. So I'm going to stop flirting with that. And they're looking for stability. But I don't think that will hold. I think that unless the mainstream progressive party, which is what Labor still, bills themselves as, whether I would probably argue that they're more on the center right, like the Democrats, but, they bill themselves as the mainstream progressive party. And so unless they actually start living up to that and offering change separate to the corporatists that we have seen is in establishment Australian media, we're going to eventually reach the point where people go, I don't care, I just want to change from this. And I think that's the real danger zone for Australian politics.
Yeah. Do we get a Katter PM?
I don't think we get a Katter PM, but I think that, and I'm going to be writing about this soon, but I think Peter Dutton on the numbers, unless there is something that I'm not seeing, he cannot win this election.
Yeah.
I mean, he had to win like 20 or so seats in order to win majority government at the start of all of this. To maintain his leadership, he's going to need to win either 65 or 68, listening to the Liberals talk about, what comes next.
Okay.
And so that would mean a net gain of at least 10 seats. And even that is looking a little bit shaky at this point. I mean, Victoria is probably going to be the strongest state for the Liberal and National Party, but they're also facing challenges in a lot of Nationals electorates, particularly like Kalpa, Calare, Wannon, Lyne, Monash. There's a lot of places where they're having to sandbag in the coalition. Which is not something I think that they necessarily planned for, because they're sandbagging against independents. They're not sandbagging against Labor. And Australian politics has always been this duality, like where they only think about the other big player rather than the fact that there's a whole community movement bubbling up underneath them.
Yeah.
So they have to win 10 seats to protect his leadership. If that doesn't happen, or if Peter Dutton is weakened, there is the possibility that there is a power vacuum that actually could be filled at some point by somebody on the far right who is competent.
A more Trump style,
Yeah.
Because I mean,
more charismatic, more competent.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I bring up Bob Katter, because I did want to just briefly, we're a little out of date on this, but you told me about his Easter message that is, there are little moments of fun in the election campaign, I guess. I missed this completely.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll just, Mike, if we could insert the message.
Jesus was crucified. Jesus died so that we might live. That's what Easter is about. 40% of the world's population acknowledge Jesus as their blessed Lord and Saviour. He went into the temple and bashed the living daylights out of the bankers and money changers and people that were making money out of the religious beliefs. Now, hey, it's Easter time. Guess who's making all the money? Woolworths and Coles. At Christmas time, Woolworths and Coles. We had a beautiful little pop-out, a nativity scene of Jesus, Mary and Joseph in the stable, and we gave it out to all the supermarkets in cans, and all the independents all put it up, and Woolworths and Coles refused to put it up. So I'll tell you what happened to the money changers in the temple. They burnt in hell. And there's a message for the likes of Woolworths and Coles.
I will say, this prompted me to do a little bit of learning. Do you know your scripture? Do you know what he's talking about with the money changers?
I have a vague idea, but I haven't gone back and looked at the scripture. So I imagine that there were a bunch of merchants who went to a temple to change over money, and God was a bit annoyed about that.
Yes, apparently. Jesus certainly was. This is, okay, my understanding, and I'm sorry, I have not done any Bible study. This is me Googling, but it's like,
sorry to all the theologists out there.
That's right, all of our theologist listeners. When you went to the temple, you had to like make an offering of a coin, but they wouldn't accept coins that had the likeness of pagan emperors. And so money changers were there to exchange basically the like Greek and Roman money for the shekel, but they apparently, some alleged, determined their own rate and were ripping people off. There were also, the merchants there who were like, oh, you want to sacrifice an animal, but you forgot to bring one? Here, you can buy one from me for, perhaps an exorbitant price. And Jesus came in and he was like, you guys shouldn't be making money off this. This is holy. And he like flipped tables and destroyed the joint. I think as Bob Catter says that he bashed them. I don't know if that's...
And he sent them to hell.
And send them to hell. That's right. And that is what Bob Catter is going to do to Coles and Woolies, right?
Yep, that is, I mean, only Bob Catter could link that part of scripture with the supermarket duopoly that we all live in. But I think there's been times when we've all been walking around Coles or Woolies and actually damning them to hell. So, I mean, we're maybe closer to being Bob Catter than we think.
Yeah, absolutely. I love it. I mean, look, he's on the money. This is the thing. It's like, Bob Catter is obviously insane, and there are various, we can speculate about what's going on with him and these rants until the cows come home, because we're in North Queensland and there's cows. But he is on the money. Like, he taps into this intense frustration with the profiteering of corporations that we all kind of rely on for essentials. It is in the mood of the quote unquote cost of living election. But this is also, I've seen you've had like you've had some takes on this being the cost of living election. That is the media consensus that's what this is. Yeah. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we all, when I say we, like us in the media, all kind of decided it was the cost of living election. Like in the lead up, the last 12 months, we've all been walking around going, this is going to be the cost of living election. And the politicians are like, yeah, this is the cost of living election, because that's an easy election to have. Because basically you just promise that you're going to ease the cost of living better than the other guys and your job is done. You don't have to think about Australia's future or Australia's vision. It's entirely in the now. But I don't think that this is the cost of living election. I think that it is absolutely an overarching issue. I mean, housing prices are insane. We've all gone backwards, even with, if you've managed to get a pay rise or you've experienced some wage growth, you've still gone backwards because the cost of everything continues to increase above, what your wage rises are. So obviously it is an issue. But it's only being considered in the now. It's only being considered as if cost of living is only going to be an issue for the next 18 months to 3 years.
Yeah, it's a temporary crisis.
So, yeah, we're all going to be fine once we get over this little hump. And I mean, the coalition literally doesn't even bake in their cost of living like relief package. They are just saying, we're going to do this for the next year. And then all of you guys are going to be totally fine. So we don't even need to continue this. So just vote for us to have a really good 12 months at the petrol Bowser. And then you're going to, then it's all gloves off. Whereas Labor is all like, look, we understand you've been struggling. We've given the stage 3 tax cuts, and now we're going to give you an extra couple of dollars a week. You're welcome.
Yes.
So that's what they're offering us. When all of these structural systemic issues in Australian society is what has led us here. It's what has exacerbated, every single price rise. The fact that it would take you 70 years to find affordable housing if housing just stopped growing right now. Like right now, if we stopped just increasing the cost of housing, it would take 70 years for housing to become affordable. And by that, I mean, it's just a little bit above the average household income is the cost of a house. That is insane. And nobody is really addressing that in the major parties. When you look at the fact that they're not addressing, inequality, there is absolutely nothing about welfare in this election. We have not heard a single thing about people living in poverty from the major parties and how they would alleviate that. We're not talking about raising the rate. We're not talking about getting rid of mutual obligations. We're not talking about disability rights. In fact, the only thing that's really come up about the NDIS is whether the coalition is going to stick to Labor's growth cut. So they're going to allow the NDIS to grow, but they're going to cap it at about, 8% or so growth. And then they're going to move everyone else to different supports, but nobody knows what those supports are yet because
TBC.
they're not there. And we've got to talk to the states about that. So we're not talking about that in this election. We're not talking about what the plan is for Australia navigating this really intense, insane geopolitical situation that's going to exist for longer than the next election cycle. Like what is happening in America is not going to magically just be over in 4 years' time. It's going to have very deep ramifications for how the world acts. And Australia is probably going to have to make a choice, whether it comes to trade or whether it becomes to security arrangements, about which path it follows. And we're not having that conversation either. Like, are we talking to the global south? We're not talking about Australia's role in Gaza and how, we're sending weapon parts to Israel or, to other nations where they're assembled into weapons and then used to kill Palestinians. We're not talking about that. We are having a very narrow conversation about cost of living. We haven't talked about Indigenous people and First Nations rights, whether we're going to actually extend to the truth-telling commission that was promised at the beginning of Labor's first term, because that's really uncomfortable. So let's just talk about your energy bills and how we're going to juice demand in the housing market, because it might make things a little bit easier in the very short term, and then call it a day.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, well, and to clarify, it's like when we say we're not hearing about this, I will say the Greens, the Greens are talking about all these things, but it's like when people are living paycheck to paycheck, it's true that a short-term relief is attractive in a way. At the same time, though, I think there is an appetite among the general populace, the Australian voting population, for longer-term, bigger picture thinking. And this is something that like I hear a lot. Like it's a kind of nebulous idea in some ways, but there is this sense when I'm door knocking that people are really sick of the like election to election short-term thinking from the major parties. But that's also, it's like easier to get a headline with, it's easier to put on a flyer, it's easier for people to grasp, because this is all that they've been offered, the idea that they could get, $1,000 off their electricity bill, or yes, a few cents off a litre off at the petrol bowser, than to understand the idea of, like reforming the entire taxation system so that we can arrest this kind of skyrocketing acceleration of house prices, or that we could reform the taxation system so that billionaires and big corporations pay their fair share in order to bring back free university, and the implications that would have for, economic equality and opportunity across the board. Like all of that's, it's a little less easy to communicate, but I do still think it's worth fighting for.
Yeah, and it absolutely is. And I think that people are able to think about both. Like people are able to think about cost of living and then also what is coming down the train. And I think that you're exactly right. A lot of voters, particularly voters under 40, are thinking about that, because they're either thinking about the fact that they're going to be renting with no rental security for like the rest of their lives, or they're going to be having to work until they're in their 80s in order to pay off their home loan and maybe leave something to a kid if they've had a kid or so. Or they're thinking, what am I about to inherit? Where am I going in this world? I mean, we haven't even been talking about climate change in this election. It's only been focused around energy. It's like, oh, climate change has been solved. They just opened up a new gas mine. They just approved a new gas mine in this election that is going to export all of the gas that it produces. It's not going to alleviate anybody's power bill. It's not helping anybody in Australia. It's just helping the people who own that gas company. That's just been ticked off by the statutory bodies. And everyone's like,
oh, well,
let's go see Peter Dutton at a petrol bowser. Let's go see Albanese hold up the Medicare card one more time. It's just, I just feel like maybe the election campaign is kind of happening on this plane, and then there's an entirely different reality that so many of us are kind of swimming in, just watching the election campaign and just going, what planet are you guys on?
Yeah, I know the climate thing. I've said this before. Like, it is truly bizarre how low and depressing how low climate ranks in terms of issues coverage, like attention this election. While as I understand it, in the same week we get the CSIRO report, the latest reef snapshot of the Great Barrier Reef that says yes, it is in a fifth widespread bleaching event since 2016 unfolding now, and the cumulative impacts are even worse than they were last summer in previous summers, because you've got the crown of thorns starfish proliferating and fucking up the whole ecosystem. It's like, yep, the reef is dying. And then in the same week, it's the Barossa offshore gas field, right? This Santos project, massive Santos project off the coast of the Northern Territory, that gets its final approval. And that rate's like barely a mention anywhere. It is truly bizarre. Yep.
It's just basically, yep, this has been approved. And everyone's just gone, oh, okay, yeah, jobs. Like, it's just, it's absolutely crazy. And I think it is the problem with the creeping towards centrism. So everything is seen through how productive it is. So we don't look at the approval of a new gas offshore project and go, wow, this is a carbon bomb. This is going to, like, even on the bare minimum, this is going to make Australia's job of lowering emissions, which we're all on board for, so much harder. This is going to put more pressure on individuals. This is not actually going to do anything to alleviate pain for Australians when it comes to paying their energy bills. We don't actually tax properly for gas.
Yeah,
most gas companies in Australia
they're not even fucking paying tax.
Nurses are paying more tax. Yeah. We are raising more money in HECS than we are from the PRRT in Australia. We just give it away for free. We cause all of these massive issues systemically, structurally, climate for Australia, and we don't even get anything back. We just give it away for free. It's so crazy.
Yeah.
But that's centrism, because we should be opening up gas fields because that's what we've been told is good for the economy. Mining is the backbone for the economy. The economy doesn't have a backbone. And if it did, it would be people. It would be our income tax.
It would be the nurses, not the gas corporations.
It's the nurses. It's anyone with a HECS debt.
Yeah.
It's anyone who pays any tax, which is mostly us in Australia. We are the backbone, and we are allowing ourselves to be dictated to by the major parties who are, heavily influenced by the vested interest that is the fossil fuel industry in Australia, to basically just convinced to gaslight everyone that if we would be completely lost if these companies suddenly had to pay their fair share. I mean, where are they going, Emerald? Where are they going? They want the gas. They want what is in Australia's ground and oceans.
That's right.
It's here. Where are they going if we said to them, you have to pay more? Like, they like doing business here because, it's basically free for them.
Yeah.
But also, it's a stable government. It's a stable economy. There are actually barriers in place. There are boundaries. They know what the rules are.
There's infrastructure, workforce, and the fucking resources. Yeah.
Exactly. So they're not going anywhere. If we taxed them, they would grumble, but they would fucking pay it. But we don't tax them because we're afraid of the grumbling. It's so insane to me.
Yes. I also think when you talk about this, like the shift to the center, and I think in my mind, this kind of ties back to this idea that, like, this is the cost of living election. It's like the homogenization of politics, I think, also says that it is sacrosanct. It is politically, unwise, whatever, to talk about anything outside this cost of living frame for the election. And so we can't be talking about, Gaza, climate change, First Nations, justice, whatever it might be. I also think it is accelerating this disengagement from voters and voters switching off, because both major parties are just matching. Labor's taking policies from the Greens, and then the LNP is matching Labor's policies. And then even the Greens, to be fair, it's like they're certainly not our number one issue is the environment anymore. The Greens are also like, it's the cost of living election because that's what everyone's competing on at the moment. And then I think that voters are looking at this and going, I don't know how to tell the parties apart anymore. We used to have parties representing a particular interest or a group. We'd have Liberal, they have a free market economy and kind of individual liberty. We'd have the Labor Party that are meant to represent union strength and a social kind of state, a social democratic state. Yeah, the worker, yep, and well-funded public services. And then you would have parties like the Greens that they also have these other pillars around social justice and economic justice, but primarily it's the environment. That's not the case anymore. The lines are incredibly blurred. And I think that, to my mind, is part of the reason that voters are saying, oh, I'm not making my mind up. We've apparently got this large proportion of voters who are undecided heading into the election, because how do you fucking tell the difference anymore?
Yeah, it's exactly right. And I think that is something that we don't know how to poll for, and we don't actually know how to pick up when we're doing the vibe check, in the media or as a polling company, because we assume that the undecideds are undecided about the major parties, whereas I think a lot of those undecideds are just trying to work out which third party their vote goes to. I think we know that the primary vote for the major parties has been declining over the last few decades, but it's been accelerated over the last decade.
Yeah.
Where, there used to be that truism that you couldn't win an election without a 4 in front of your primary number, your primary vote number. And now it's just kind of like they would love to have anything approaching a 4 in, like they would freaking love that. If they were polling at 39%, they would be like, yes, like we're still here. They still love us.
They love us, yeah.
Because it's not the way that it used to be of like 40-40-20. It's now breaking up into thirds.
Yeah.
I mean, and at least Albanese has addressed that, where he's talking to people and saying, well, we can't rely on things being 40-40-20 anymore, because we know that it's now looking to be more 30-30-30, and who knows where like the last 10% will go. And so it's really interesting, like watching leaders' debates and stuff and listening to some of the commentators talk where they're like, oh, and there's still this third who are undecided about the major parties. I'm like, no, they've decided about the major parties. They don't want that. They're deciding which place to put their primary preference in the independents and minor parties. And we are seeing that not just with the Greens, we're seeing that with One Nation. One Nation is getting a little bit of surge of support, particularly in outer suburban seats and the national electorates, where the coalition has basically put its entire election strategy into, like, we need to win these seats in order to win Australia. We're seeing libertarians rise up, and if you're considering voting Libertarian, I would very much encourage you to look at the origins of that party in Australia. We're seeing like the crumpets of tinfoiled hats or whatever Clive Palmer's latest party is called. We're seeing that they're still getting a big chunk of that discontented vote. But then we're also seeing a lot of community independents and Greens candidates starting to get a look in areas where traditionally you would not expect that to happen. I mean, Cowper is one that the Nationals are very rightly so worried about, because it looks like the independent there is going to get across the line at this point of the campaign. And that has completely freaked out the Nationals, but it's also kind of freaked out Labor, where they're like, oh, if this is happening now to the coalition, this is going to start happening to us very soon.
Yeah.
And in Queensland, it is most likely to be the Greens that start encroaching more on Labor electorates. But we're going to start seeing that across the country. where you're going to start seeing voters who have never been married to a major party, who don't know the difference between the major parties, which is something that they have done themselves, which means that it's just whether you like the leader or not at this point of the major parties.
Very true.
Because their policy offerings are not that particularly different. So which personality do you like, the red or the blue one? And, you know, if the blue one managed to find a better personality, like that would just make people go, oh, well, you've got pretty much the same ideas, so we'll go blue this time. You're going to start seeing people just more and more start looking elsewhere. And that is not necessarily a bad thing, depending on what the elsewhere does with its power, if it has the balance of power. And it can be a very good thing. Negotiation in the parliament is a very good thing. But if you're not thinking about what some of the candidates in the elsewhere stand for, if you're just angry and you just go whatever crumpets, like whatever toast, like, you know, whatever banana bread, and then you suddenly find that banana bread has the balance of power in both the House and the Senate, is that something that you necessarily wanted if they don't actually align with your values? So I just think that the only danger I see as we continue to fracture away from the major parties is people not actually looking at what some of the candidates are standing for. And it's really obvious when they're like properly racist or in court or, you know, beating up on grandmas or, you know, whatever. That's really obvious. What is less obvious, and we're seeing it in America, we're seeing it sweep through Europe, is the kind of charismatic fascists that are starting to come through mainstream politics, who present well, who talk about like how you have a right to be angry because the system has turned, as you know, left you behind. But they don't actually talk about how they're kind of happy that that's happened and they would like to, you know, cement that in so that it's only white people or it's only people of a particular class who manage to rise above, like, you know, the cesspit of diversity or whatever it is that they are angry about. That's the danger, I think, when you start having more and more people start to fracture away from a major party system.
Is the One Nation vote, like, because you said it's growing in some of those suburban seats, is it falling in the city and that's kind of evening out? Because my understanding was, and I haven't been following this super closely, but like that their national vote isn't necessarily going up.
Yeah.
Are they,
like,
is it?
One Nation's always really hard, especially when they don't run in every seat. So it's really hard to poll them nationally because they're not in every seat. They target very specifically certain seats. And sometimes it's as a give me to the coalition because they know that they're going to help the coalition in some seats. And sometimes it's because they think that they've got an actual chance. I mean, One Nation's vote is growing in South Australia, I saw a couple of weeks ago. Like, you know, you're starting to see One Nation pop up in areas where it hasn't necessarily before. And that's the other story of this election. I mean, it's like, you know, one of those old things that we say, an old adage, this is an election of 150 different elections. But this one actually is. There is something different going on in every seat. Like in Wannon, it's roads and insurance. You know, in the inner cities, in the teal seats, it's about, you know, integrity and still women's issues and those sorts of things. Like it is literally 150 different elections. And that means that minor parties like One Nation that have just basically made a career out of people's anger and discontentment and, you know, racism and everything else that goes with One Nation, they are targeting those seats where they're going, okay, there's a high number of pensioners here, there's a high number of unemployed people here, there's a high number of, people who maybe have been injured at work and haven't worked for the last few decades or so, have been left behind by a changing society, like all of those people, the people who still print out like the old chain letter memes that are, you know, terrible and hand them around at work. Like that's One Nation's kind of target market. But they're also starting to pick Facebook. But they're also starting to pick up younger people, men's rights activists, people who have been felt like they've been unfairly treated by the family court. So they pick younger people who just want to have a troll. Like they're picking up those people as well. So outer suburban, regional areas, middle and, northern Queensland, they're having like a pretty red hot go there. And they're polling around anywhere between 8 and 12% where you look at it.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, okay.
I mean,
Well, and
it kind of, I was going to say, it just sort of goes to how much our politics is, the center has shifted to the right. Like, coalition has essentially thrown away the 30-year John Howard decree that it wouldn't preference one nation and has just gone, yes, we're going to start preferencing one nation.
True.
And it's their Hail Mary pass because they have failed in this election campaign. The momentum's not with them. They have nothing to offer. So they're trying to sandbag by getting into bed officially with one nation.
Yes.
And Pauline Hanson's basically been on a victory tour where she's just been all like, oh, they came to me and I've pulped my how to vote cards because I really need to help the coalition. I need to help Peter Dutton. And nobody blinked an eye. Like, nobody just went, oh, wow, that's kind of crazy. We wouldn't even consider that 15 years ago. Everyone goes, yeah, that makes sense. Like, that's how much we have shifted in these things.
Yeah. And you're right. It is so hard it's hard to get a sense of what's happening in these individual seats from nationwide polling, even when we have MRP, that kind of tries to stratify it into seats. It's not always on point because it doesn't account for those local things. And it's also one where, when we're looking at polling of undecided voters, because we were talking about this before the show and you were kind of skeptical around how that undecided voter, I guess, category works. And there are different ways that they do it, but they can't necessarily take account of particularly, independent candidates that might be running in that seat. I saw that the Guardian Essential poll does report on people who say that they are undecided. They have a category for undecided voters. Essential asks a question that's like, how firm is your vote? So then they report it. They say, so you say you would vote Labor, but are you saying you might change your mind, or you haven't quite decided, or are you totally firm? I have changed my mind. And in March, I see that there's this graph from an Essential poll that came out in March that showed, it's like about half of people in that graph are undecided in their vote. If you look at the Resolve reporting, it shows that leading up to the election, like even quite close to the election, it's like a third of people are still undecided, which is much higher than in previous elections. What's interesting, though, is you would think, this doesn't take account of particular seats where a lot of people might be interested in voting for an independent. But I saw The Guardian also pointed out that when respondents are asked which party or candidate they plan to put first and there's a not sure option, they'll often put, or there's no not sure option, if they can't say not sure, they'll often put independent just because they're like, well, I'm not sure who I want to vote for, so independent sounds good, and that can skew the data. So, I mean, I don't know. I don't know if there is a higher proportion of undecided voters heading into the election, but it would make sense to me on the basis of what we were talking about, that it's like neither major party, none of what they're seeing in the media from the major parties who are presented as their options is really getting at like what they're craving, which is like something big, something long-term, something that goes beyond the next 4 years.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely right. And I think, again, it is seat by seat, right? Like, it is really hard to poll the areas where there is a mood for change, but that change isn't necessarily set in stone for a major party. And I think that what the major parties are worried about is where that number 2 preference goes. Like, if you've voted one independent or minor party, where does number 2 go?
Yeah.
Or where does number 3 go? Because that's what they're aiming for with those undecided. So I suppose when we talk about, undecided or people who have moved into voting for a minor party or independents, the major parties are now fighting to have their candidate placed above the other in the preference flow, because they if it goes to, preferences, they want it to stop at them rather than the other guys because, preferential voting, it's one of the greatest things Australia has in protecting, its democracy, and we should all work very, very hard to protect it because the Atlas Network is coming for it, and they've already started, making inroads in how it's a very unfair system for the left. I mean, we wish, but it's should definitely be protected. But the major parties don't know where those, undecided on the majors, we're voting independent, we're voting minor party, then where do we go? And that's kind of what they're fighting for.
Yeah.
And it's really hard to poll that because, Essential does great work. I'm not sure if Resolve is a member of the Australian Polling Council or not, but you can tell some of the big Australian pollsters are members of the Australian Polling Council, where you can go and you can look at their methodology. You can see whether there's any leading questions before they ask you who you want to vote for. They lay out exactly how they've asked people, where they've polled, how they've polled, what the options are, what questions might be related to other questions in how they've worked those results. And some companies aren't. Some it's very opaque as to how they've managed to put those numbers together. But what none of them can do, because it's kind of impossible, is work out that preference flow, because when people are on a poll, they're not going to sit there hitting 6 numbers. They get sick of it. And that is one of the things that has really kind of worried the major parties. I mean, I know that Labor strategists will, they're saying to me that their vote has softened over the last couple of weeks, and they're unsure as to why that's not coming up in the major polls, whereas the coalition
according to the polls, Labor's doing great.
Well, I mean, Labor's doing flop over the line great, according to the polls, but I think that, there's 2 things when strategists talk to you about that, right? One is to make people get worried that they're going to lose and therefore think, oh shit, Peter Dutton might actually make it to the lodge.
I need to vote for them and not the Greens.
Yeah. And the other reason is that it kind of can set out that maybe they're not quite as, in this context, not quite as confident as majority government as has been put forward by some of them. And I would say that looking at the polls, looking at the seats individually, a Labor-led minority government at this point, from the pathway that I've been looking at, is probably still the most likely outcome. I think that they're probably going to fall 2 or 3 seats short of a majority. I mean, if everything goes their way, they could potentially win majority, but they're in trouble in Aston. That seat's probably gone back to the Libs. Not sure if they'll win Tangy. Not sure if they win Bullwinkle. They have to hold on to Gilmore, which is, pretty tough at this point. They'd probably need to pick up one of the Brisbane seats that the Greens hold, which is absolutely not guaranteed. They're having issues in McEwen. Will's very likely to go green at this particular point, so that's an issue. Then there's Patterson, which is still an issue. Franklin could go independent. Lyons is not necessarily a lock. There's enough seats that Labor hold that could go either coalition or green. That doesn't make majority government set in stone. But for the coalition, they're so far out that they're literally just talking about how many seats it would take for Peter Dutton to maintain his leadership.
Yeah.
That's something that the polls find very hard to pick up on.
Yeah, yeah. Why do you think that, what I can't get my head around is if people, and I've seen this again, door knocking, people are so disengaged, saying that they haven't made their mind up. They're effectively I don't care, it doesn't matter. And yet more people are getting out and voting earlier than, I don't know if it's record breaking yet, but I know that there have been lots of reports this week around huge numbers of people voting early, which is traditionally thought to be something that when people are keen to go and vote a particular way, they go and vote early. So what what is going on there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is coming up. If the trend sticks, it'll be record breaking. So you had about 540,000 vote when voting opened on Tuesday. It was about 590,000 on the Wednesday. I haven't seen the Thursday figures, but I imagine that they're very similar. So we're predicting, the AEC is predicting that there would be at least half of registered voters will have cast their ballot before May 3, which is huge. That is absolutely huge. And election campaigns, as you would know, Emerald, are structured around trying to convince everybody in the final 2 weeks. Well, you've already lost half your voters this time round. So, thanks for spending all your advertising and keeping mainstream media propped up, but nobody's really looking at it. It's. I think there's a whole bunch of people who just want to get it over and done with. They just want to be able to live their lives and completely switch off from the election.
Sick of the election.
Yeah, they just want to keep, they want to be able to doom scroll without having to feel the obligation to sit and watch whatever political thing comes up on their screens. But I also think that there are a lot of people who probably made up their minds even before the election started or in the very early stages of the election where they were like, okay, this is a train wreck. This is what I'm going to go vote on. And that's what they're doing. What I find kind of hilarious though is that you used to have a reason to do early voting. When I would turn up to early vote, they would be like, why are you early voting? Where are you going on holiday? Can you not do a postal vote? Do you absolutely, is this the only option? And now they're all like, yep, thank you. Off you go.
On you go.
So,
yeah, I know. Well, it's since COVID, right? Because during COVID, they deliberately tried to space out voting so that it wasn't huge crowds of people showing up on election day. It was encouraged then, in addition to, phone voting and postal voting. And now it is back to, technically you need a reason, but they're not asking you for your Airbnb booking.
No one's interrogating
long weekend away.
They're not asking you if you've looked at the menus of that restaurant yet and decided on your main meal. Yeah. It's also it makes the AEC's job easier though too, right? Rather than having 18 million people turn up on May 3, they're having 9 million turn up on May 3, which is it's easier for the Electoral Commission. I'm sure that's not the reason why that, they're not encouraging early voting, but I would say I myself would hypothesize that it's easier for the Electoral Commission to deal with less people on one day and have it spread out over 2 weeks. So, I mean, you used to be able to do early voting much earlier in the campaign as well. And now they've narrowed it down to the 2 weeks. They actually changed the legislation. But it is also interesting if you look at the Queensland state election, Stephen Miles' Labor, which is probably the most progressive Labor party, within the country in terms of the policies that they started putting forward, probably would have won that election if early voting had not happened. Yeah, they had another 2 weeks.
They were winning,
or early voting had happened. You're looking at the results now, he probably would have won that election and held on. So if you're just doing it to get it over and done with, but you haven't actually made up your mind, maybe just make sure that your mind is set before you go into the polling booth.
Yes. I mean, this is what I've been thinking about is I'm sure there are people who are just, maybe they're going into the city for work and they see that the booth's open already and they're like, I'll just go and do it on my lunch break. Then I won't have to go in on a Saturday. But they haven't been paying attention. They haven't really made their mind up. And then maybe a week from now, because there's obviously still going to be a whole lot of noise and information about the parties and what they're offering. And maybe a week from now they go, oh, actually, no. There is something in this election that would have affected my life, or I could have voted for. I'm obviously going to say this as a Green, but maybe then they realize they could have voted for a Green. Maybe they didn't realize that the Greens could win in their election, or their electorate, or they didn't know what they were offering. And it's it does make me a little bit sad and stressed to think about the people who are just fuck it, I'll just get it out of the way. And it also, it's one of those things. Yeah, just think about it. And I think I think compulsory voting is great. It is much better than the American system, for example, where it's non-compulsory and you need to register. But there's a kind of two sides to that coin where, because it's not an active choice that Australians make to get involved in politics, in voting, sometimes it does have that effect of people just not taking their vote as seriously or valuing it as they could. And like I said, to be clear, I think it'd be terrible for democracy to not make it compulsory. But I think about that as well. So you're right. Yes, please think about people who are listening to this show don't need to know that, but maybe it's like remind the people in your life to just spend half an hour, 15 minutes even reading the policy pages.
Inconvenience yourself for the country.
Yeah. That's right. I guess, we have spoken about all of the things that haven't been covered in this election. Just quickly, because it has come in as this kind of last, I guess like a late contender for an issue of the election. And maybe it's because I'm in an inner city seat. I've been seeing a little bit of talk this week about, violence against women and what the parties are offering on that. Can you give us a quick, comparison or summary of what's being offered on that? And do you think that it will have an impact on voting in a similar way that I think it did in the Queensland state election, for example?
I think that is one of the issues that a lot of people, particularly women, are thinking about, because as Sherelle Moody, who's the founder of Australian Femicide Watch and the Red Heart campaign, has been pointing out and reporting, at least 7 women have died in this election campaign, allegedly their partners or former partners being involved, including 4 in 1 week. And that's kind of what's created a bit of a flurry of attention. And it's not the political parties going, oh, wow, this is an issue. It's people in the public going, why aren't you talking about this? This is a massive, massive issue. And so we've seen some reaction to that and, to the work that people like Sherelle are doing in this space. And the major parties have responded where Labor's said, well, we've already got our 10-year plan, but we're going to add a few million to that in terms of improving crisis accommodation. But really, we're going to stick to our previous plan that we announced in the last parliament, which, is, I think it's got a figure of like $1 billion, but it's kind of misleading. There's still not enough money for community legal clinics. There's still not enough money for crisis accommodation. There's payments now, for women who need to escape very quickly, but they're very difficult to access and they don't necessarily cover, bond and the basics and essentials like that. So not the greatest policy, but that's what Labor is holding on to. The coalition have said that they'll spend an additional $90 million over 10 years, just basically helping, on some of those issues that we've already spoken about. But at the same time, the coalition announced $21 billion over 5 years for defence.
Yeah.
So it's one of those things where they go, yes, we care about this, but not as much as you do. We much prefer to prioritise this part of the budget because if you spent the money, you could address it in Australia. But they don't want to spend the money because they prioritise spending money on billions and billions and billions of dollars in defence that don't even necessarily lead anywhere. A lot of the time that money just goes to consultants, whereas we know that money spent on civil society and domestic and family violence services, that money does go to the people who need it. When we spend money in defence, it usually goes to consultants and contractors who don't even have to deliver projects. So it's an issue of priorities and the major parties have set theirs and it's just up to voters as to whether they agree with that or not.
I do think we've spoken on the show before, like I have, I guess, complicated feelings around politicians claiming that they can solve or really address, gendered violence just by funding services. Like I think there's that question of there's a response, there's, I guess, parking an ambulance at the bottom of the cliff kind of response and like frontline services, helplines, emergency accommodation, financial payments, like those things are absolutely needed and overwhelmed at the moment. But it's also, there's a social kind of a structural change that would be needed that's much harder to package up in the final 2 weeks of the election campaign.
Yeah, I mean, but absolutely. And that is ongoing. But I also think that, the major parties are able to use that as a bit of an excuse too, where they go, oh, this needs to be a whole of the society change in order for us to do anything, which is true. But it's also true that they could help that because it's not happening in a vacuum. We know that financial stress is one of the biggest reasons for domestic and family violence. We can pick the at-risk men. There's already a lot of researchers and a lot of people doing a lot of work in being able to identify men who are at risk of turning violent against their partners. Because this idea that, they lose control completely negates the fact that these men manage to mostly go to work, go hang out with their friends, go to footy, exist in society without losing control. And then they lose control, when they're in front of somebody who is vulnerable. So we know we can address that, but we don't actually put in place the money in order to help the programs that can start addressing that. We don't address, financial stress. We allow people to live in poverty and in just very precarious financial situations. We don't have housing security in this country. We don't address anger or male anger in this country, and we could do more of that. We don't, fund the programs that men go to for help if they are feeling vulnerable and they think that they might actually lose control. We don't give enough funding for those programs, and they have to turn away men who have actually identified within themselves that there is an issue. So it is a whole of society problem. And I mean, I think it's probably another episode if we talk about some of the biggest issues now with the manosphere and everything that is happening, in the toxic masculinity space. But I mean, it's also kind of the endpoint of capitalism, right? We don't want men to be healthy, because if men were healthy, then society might work a little bit better and we wouldn't need capitalism as much. So much easier to keep men feeling, scared of their own emotions, feeling vulnerable, feeling angry, feeling isolated and disconnected from society, because then everyone starts turning on each other rather than turning up top.
Exactly. And I think that the underlying, economic security and those big picture kind of reforms that would benefit everyone, but mean that women, most of the time in particular, have, a safe base from which they might be more able to leave a violent or a potentially violent relationship as well. It's particularly talking about social security rates, and that's the kind of thing that's often missing. And that, I would say again, the Greens at least. I think it was actually this week they just relaunched their proposal for a guaranteed livable income. So again, something that only the Greens are putting on the table. I think we're running out of time, but do you have any other, you've given kind of your prediction for the election is at this stage still a Labor minority government. Do you have any other fun or exciting predictions before we finish up?
No, I think just maybe watch the national seats, because I think that could be a little bit fun for people who enjoy watching people get shocked.
Okay, all right. We'll watch the national seats. Yeah, that will be fun.
If you want to see older white men cry or get angry, maybe watch some of the national seats.
Absolutely, I do. All right, we'll remember that. Amy Remeikis, thank you so much for coming back on the show. It is a pleasure to have you. Where can people find more of your work?
You can find me on the Australia Institute. I am live blogging the election and will live blog Parliament too when that resumes. And you can also find me in the New Daily on Sundays or Mondays with a weekly column, or on Pajama Politics, where I just rant and cry about the state of Australian politics.
We love it. We love Pajama Politics. Well, thank you. Thanks, Amy. And thanks for listening to Serious Danger. Tom and I will be back next week for a slightly late episode. We'll be recording after the election. Feeling God fucking knows how on Sunday morning. So the episode will be late, but we're hoping that it will be interesting, if nothing else. And in the meantime, you can support the show on Patreon, patreon.com/SeriousDangerAU, or follow us at SeriousDangerAU on all of the social medias. And until then, happy election, everyone.
Yeah, take care of you.
Bye.
Serious Danger Australia.